When my daughter got married, I kept quiet that I had inherited my late wife's massive fortune. I thought I was protecting her. Good thing I stayed silent because exactly 1 week after the wedding, my new son-in-law and his entire family showed up at my house with a notary and a terrifying threat. But their arrogant smiles disappeared when they realized who they were actually dealing with. I am Hollis. I am 69 years old, and I am still processing the ultimate betrayal by the only family I had left. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who underestimated your worth and tried to take advantage of your kindness. I was sweeping up the last of the silver confetti from the living room floor. It had been exactly 1 week since I walked my beautiful daughter Jasmine down the aisle. My back ached from the physical labor of cleaning up the post-wedding brunch I had hosted, but the familiar quiet of my old wooden house usually brought me a deep sense of peace. I built this house with my own 2 hands and my late wife's vision. That peace shattered completely when the front door burst open without a single knock. Logan, my 32-year-old son-in-law, marched right into my home as if he owned the place. He was a white man who worked in corporate finance, always wearing flashy designer suits he definitely could not afford, and walking with an unearned aggressive arrogance. Right behind him were his parents looking down their noses at my modest furniture with blatant, undisguised disgust. They always treated me like I was the hired help instead of family. Trailing behind them was a nervous-looking stranger clutching a heavy leather briefcase. There was no polite greeting. There was no asking how I was doing after the exhausting wedding weekend. Logan tossed a thick stack of legal papers onto my coffee table, carelessly knocking over a framed photo of my late wife. He pointed a sharp finger at the documents and told me to sign them immediately. I asked him what exactly he was throwing onto my table in my own home. He smirked, puffing out his chest, and proudly stated it was a deed transfer. He wanted me to sign over the title of my home, a house I had fully paid off decades ago, directly to him and Jasmine. He casually claimed it was just collateral for a new business loan he was taking out, acting as if he were asking to borrow a cup of sugar instead of demanding my entire life savings. The stranger with the briefcase stepped forward, introducing himself as a notary public ready to witness my signature and make it legally binding on the exact spot. I stood there gripping my broom, staring at the sheer audacity of this young boy standing in my living room and demanding the roof over my head. Logan told me that since I was getting older, a big house was a total waste of space for one single man. His father chimed in, saying it was the absolute least I could do to support my daughter's new marriage, especially since they were destined for a high society lifestyle, while I clearly belonged in the past. I completely ignored Logan and his arrogant parents. My eyes desperately searched the room for the only person who mattered in this entire nightmare. Jasmine was standing near the doorway, half hidden in the shadows of the hall. My 28-year-old daughter, a brilliant medical resident, the beautiful girl I had sacrificed everything for. I waited for her to step up. I waited for her to tell her husband he was entirely out of line, to tell him to show some basic respect to her father. But she just stared at the hardwood floor, absolutely silent and totally complicit. Her silence was a physical blow to my chest. It hurt far more than anything Logan could ever say or do. I looked at her and saw the ghost of her mother. When my wife Corinne passed away, Jasmine was just a little girl who needed her dad. I spent 40 long years working brutal, exhausting shifts as a lead structural engineer to make sure she never wanted for anything in this world. I packed her lunches every single morning, I drove her to every science fair across the state, and I paid every single cent of her expensive medical school tuition so she would graduate without a dime of student debt. I built my entire life around her happiness and her future. I gave up massive career promotions that would have required constant travel, just so I could be home for dinner with her every single night. And now she was standing in the house I raised her in, letting a man she had known for barely 2 years try to steal it right from under me. The betrayal was suffocating, making it hard to even breathe. I realized right then that she was completely under his manipulative control. Logan had spent the last 2 years convincing her that his flashy, debt-fueled lifestyle was the future and that my quiet, disciplined life was an embarrassment to them both. He was using her to get to me, and she was letting him do it without putting up a single fight. I took a deep, shaky breath, steadying my hands on the wooden broom handle. I looked Logan dead in the eye and told him absolutely not. I told him to take his notary and his disrespectful parents and get out of my house immediately. Logan's confident, smug smirk vanished instantly. He took a threatening step toward me, trying to use his height and youth to intimidate me, but I did not flinch. I have faced much worse men than him in my lifetime, and I was not going to be bullied in my own living room. That was when his mother, a woman who always wore too much heavy perfume and fake pearls, stepped forward with a cold, predatory smile on her face. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slapping it down right on top of the deed transfer. She looked at me with fake, dripping pity and told me I was not thinking clearly at all. She said it was such a terrible tragedy how quickly the mind goes at my age. I slowly put down my broom and picked up the paper. It was an emergency medical guardianship application. I read the formal printed words and my blood ran ice cold. It was signed by a psychiatrist I had never met or even heard of in my entire life. The forged document confidently claimed I was exhibiting severe signs of early onset dementia, that I was prone to sudden violent outbursts, and that I was completely unfit to manage my own finances or live independently in my own home. Logan crossed his arms over his chest and told me they were doing this for my own good because they loved me. He said if I signed the house over voluntarily today, they would be generous and let me live quietly in a small, cheap retirement home nearby. But if I fought them on this, they would file the emergency guardianship papers first thing Monday morning. They promised they would legally declare me incompetent, take the house anyway, and lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward where no one would ever hear from me again. They gave me exactly 24 hours to make my choice. The notary quickly packed up his briefcase, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. Without another single word, the four of them turned around and walked out of my front door. Jasmine followed them out into the bright daylight, never once looking back at me to see the devastation on my face. I was left standing completely alone in the deafening quiet of my living room, holding the forged paper that threatened to erase my entire existence and strip away my freedom. But what they did not know was that they had just picked a fight with a man who had a brilliant corporate lawyer on speed dial and a whole lot of financial resources they knew absolutely nothing about. The moment the heavy wooden front door clicked shut behind them, I dropped the act completely. The violent trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The look of terrified confusion I had carefully plastered on my face melted away, replaced by a cold, calculated focus. I walked over to the front window and pulled back the curtain just a fraction of an inch. I watched Logan usher his arrogant parents and the nervous notary into his least luxury SUV. I watched him slap the steering wheel in frustration before speeding off down my quiet street. They truly believed they had just cornered a helpless, senile old man who was too fragile to fight back. They thought my silence was submission. They had absolutely no idea they had just stepped into a steel trap of their own making. I turned away from the window and walked straight to the coffee table. I picked up the emergency medical guardianship application they had so proudly slapped down like a winning lottery ticket. I read the fraudulent claims again. The document stated I was unfit to manage my own finances, prone to sudden violent outbursts and suffering from advanced dementia. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. I walked into my home office, closed the thick oak doors, and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I bypassed my regular contacts and scrolled down to an encrypted number I only used for major emergencies. I hit dial. The phone rang exactly twice before a sharp, no-nonsense voice answered. It was Bradley. Bradley was not a small-town family lawyer who handled petty neighborhood disputes or minor traffic tickets. He was a ruthless corporate attorney, a legal shark, who operated out of a high-rise in the city center. He specialized in high-stakes trust management, aggressive asset protection, and destroying people who tried to steal from his clients. I had paid his firm a small fortune in retainers over the years for exactly this kind of situation. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him my son-in-law had just ambushed me with a fraudulent deed transfer and a fake medical evaluation signed by a corrupt psychiatrist. I told him they gave me exactly 24 hours to surrender my home voluntarily, or they would move to have me legally committed to a state psychiatric ward. Bradley did not gasp. He did not offer any fake sympathy. He simply asked me if I was finally ready to take the gloves off and show them who they were really dealing with. I told him it was time to prepare the financial guillotine. As Bradley began typing rapidly on his mechanical keyboard, I walked over to the large framed portrait of my late wife, Corinne, hanging above my mahogany desk. When Logan and his snobby parents looked at me, they saw a retired working-class structural engineer living on a modest pension. They saw a man who drove a 10-year-old truck, wore flannel shirts, and lived in a simple wooden house. That was exactly what I wanted them to see. What they did not know was the massive secret I had been carrying since the day Corinne died. Corinne was not just a loving mother and a supportive wife. She was a brilliant pioneer in early medical software development. Before she passed away, she patented a complex data encryption system that quietly became the mandatory security standard for major hospital networks across the entire country. Those patents generated immense, staggering wealth. When she died, she left me completely in charge of an $18 million irrevocable trust fund. We made a strict binding agreement on her deathbed. We agreed that Jasmine would never know the true extent of our wealth until she turned 35 or proved she could navigate the world on her own. Corinne grew up seeing sudden money destroy families, turning siblings into bitter enemies and attracting greedy predators. I kept the millions completely hidden because I wanted my daughter to have a normal life. I wanted her to learn the genuine value of hard work. I wanted her to become a doctor through her own relentless studying and merit. Most importantly, I wanted her to find a partner who loved her for her mind and her heart, not a gold digger looking for a free ride. I played the role of the struggling, hard-working single father flawlessly. I paid for her expensive medical school tuition by quietly liquidating small, untraceable assets from the trust, always telling her I was picking up extra shifts and taking out heavy federal loans. My deception worked perfectly for years. Jasmine grew up grounded and fiercely driven, but my master plan had one fatal flaw. I never anticipated she would be isolated and manipulated by a man who was so greedy he would try to steal the very house I lived in, assuming it was my only valuable asset. I instructed Bradley to immediately pull up the extreme financial surveillance protocols we had established years ago. I wanted a complete, exhaustive audit of every single account Logan had his hands on. I needed to know exactly how desperate my son-in-law really was to risk a federal felony forgery charge over a single piece of real estate. Bradley agreed and told me he was logging into the secure banking portal. While he ran the background checks on Logan, I asked him to check on the one account I actually shared with my daughter. It was a standard joint checking account I had set up years ago, specifically to cover Jasmine's medical residency expenses, her rent, and her daily groceries. I always kept exactly $50,000 in it, replenishing it quietly from my personal funds whenever it dipped low. It was my way of making sure she never had to stress about basic survival while working grueling 80-hour shifts at the hospital. I heard Bradley stop typing. The silence on the phone was sudden and incredibly heavy. He cleared his throat, his professional tone dropping into something much more serious. He asked me when I last checked the balance on the residency account. I told him it had been a few weeks, but it should have been fully funded at the standard $50,000 mark. Bradley took a deep breath and told me the current balance was exactly zero. My chest tightened. I asked him where the money went, assuming Logan had somehow hacked the online portal or initiated a fraudulent wire transfer for his fake business venture. But Bradley gave me an answer that made my blood run completely cold. He told me the entire $50,000 had been drained in a single massive cash withdrawal at a specialized 24-hour bank branch across town. I demanded to know what time the transaction occurred. He said it happened at exactly 3:00 in the morning, the night before the ambush in my living room. I asked him who authorized a massive cash withdrawal of that size in the middle of the night without triggering a fraud alert. Bradley paused again before delivering the crushing blow. He said the bank security system registered the transaction using a highly secure biometric personal identification number. It was Jasmine's PIN. My own daughter had emptied the account in the dead of night, handing over every last cent I had given her, leaving me with nothing but a zero balance and a fake dementia diagnosis hanging over my head. I hung up the phone and stood in the absolute silence of my home office. The revelation that Jasmine had drained $50,000 from our joint account felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. For a few agonizing minutes, the urge to call my daughter was completely overwhelming. I wanted to scream into the receiver, demand an explanation, and ask her how she could possibly betray the father who had given her everything. I picked up my phone and stared at her contact name. My thumb hovered over the call button. Then the cold reality of the situation washed over me. If I called her now, driven by emotion and heartbreak, I would show them my hand. I would become the chaotic, irrational old man they were trying to paint me as in their fraudulent medical documents. I put the phone back down on the mahogany desk. There would be no emotional confrontation. There would be no tears or screaming matches. Logan and his greedy family had chosen to declare war on me, and I was going to fight back with absolute terrifying silence. I left the office and walked down the narrow wooden stairs into my unfinished basement. The air was cool and smelled of old pine and motor oil. I walked past the neat rows of power tools and storage boxes until I reached the far back wall, which was covered by a heavy, dusty workbench. I gripped the edges of the heavy oak table and shoved it to the side, my muscles burning from the effort. Behind the workbench was a false section of drywall I had installed over 20 years ago. I popped the wooden panel loose, revealing a large, heavy steel wall safe embedded directly into the concrete foundation. I spun the combination dial, the heavy metallic clicks echoing in the empty basement. The thick steel door swung open. Inside were neat, organized stacks of legal documents, the original patent certificates with Corinne's signature, and the master ledger for the $18 million trust fund. I pulled out a thick leather binder containing all the financial leverage I needed to completely destroy the people trying to ruin my life. I carried the heavy binder to a small folding table in the center of the basement, turned on a single overhead bulb, and began preparing for a war they could never possibly win. I spent hours meticulously reviewing the trust structure, making a list of liquid assets I could mobilize immediately without triggering any public financial red flags. It was past midnight and the house above me was completely silent. Suddenly, the distinct, sharp sound of a key sliding into the front door lock shattered the quiet. I froze. I reached up and clicked off the single overhead basement light, plunging myself into total darkness. The heavy front door creaked open and gently clicked shut. Someone was inside my house. I knew for a fact I had locked the deadbolt. The only other person in the entire world who had a spare key to that door was Jasmine. I crept silently to the bottom of the basement stairs, my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I heard the heavy, arrogant footsteps walking across the hardwood floor directly above my head. It was not my daughter. It was the heavy tread of a man wearing dress shoes. It was Logan. He had used Jasmine's spare key to sneak back into my home in the dead of night. I slowly climbed the wooden stairs, placing my feet carefully on the very edges of the steps to avoid making even the slightest creak. I cracked the basement door open just a fraction of an inch and peered into the dark hallway. A beam of light from a heavy flashlight was sweeping frantically across my bedroom walls. Logan was tearing my private space apart. I heard the sound of drawers being violently yanked open and their contents dumped onto the floor. He was tossing my closet, ripping through my filing cabinets, and tearing the mattress off my bed. I stood in the dark hallway, completely hidden in the shadows, and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I swiped the screen, opened the voice recorder application, and hit the red record button. I held the phone up in the darkness, capturing the exact audio of my son-in-law ransacking my home. The destructive noise abruptly stopped. Logan let out a loud, frustrated curse. Then I heard the sound of a phone dialing. He put it on speaker, the volume low but loud enough for the microphone on my phone to pick up every single word. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and impatient. It was absolutely not Jasmine. Logan started speaking in a frantic, panicked whisper. He told the woman he was turning the entire house upside down, but he could not find the old man's life insurance policy anywhere. The woman on the phone cursed and told him he was running out of time. Logan's voice cracked with genuine, pathetic fear. He told her they desperately needed to find the cash value of the policy so he could take a loan against it. He explicitly stated that he needed the money to pay off the Vegas guys by Friday at midnight. He confessed that if he did not hand over the cash by the deadline, the syndicate was going to break both of his legs and take everything he owned. The woman sharply asked him what Jasmine was doing to help. Logan let out a cruel, mocking laugh. He told the woman not to worry about his stupid wife, boasting that Jasmine still firmly believed he needed my house as collateral to start a legitimate financial hedge fund. He called my daughter a clueless idiot who would do whatever he told her to do. The call ended. Logan stomped out of my bedroom, stormed down the hallway, and walked right out my front door, locking it behind him. I stood in the dark, staring at the glowing red timer on my recording app. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to bury him. The very next morning, the bright city sun was shining through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Bradley's downtown law office. I sat in a sleek leather chair across from his massive glass desk, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. I placed my cell phone on the polished glass hit play and let Logan's panicked midnight confession fill the quiet room. Bradley listened with his hands steepled under his chin, his face in a motionless mask. When the recording finished, Bradley let out a low whistle. He leaned back in his chair and explained exactly who Logan was dealing with. The Vegas guys were not a legitimate bank or a standard loan shark operation. They were a highly dangerous, sophisticated underground lending syndicate that catered specifically to desperate corporate brokers and high-rolling gamblers. Bradley made 2 highly encrypted phone calls to private investigators on his payroll. Within 20 minutes, we had the exact details. Logan was not a financial genius. He was a degenerate gambling addict who had lost massive amounts of money on illegal sports betting. He was currently $600,000 in debt to a criminal organization, and they were officially calling in the marker. Bradley asked me if I wanted to hand the recording over to the police. He pointed out that we had Logan on tape committing breaking and entering, attempted burglary, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I shook my head slowly. Sending Logan to a comfortable state-funded prison cell was entirely too easy. If he went to jail right now, Jasmine would still view him as a misunderstood victim, a struggling entrepreneur who made a mistake. I needed to completely dismantle his entire life and expose his absolute worthlessness to my daughter and his arrogant parents. I looked at Bradley and gave him a very specific, ruthless instruction. I told him to immediately establish a blind, anonymous, limited liability company. I wanted him to use the massive liquid capital in my trust fund to reach out to the underground syndicate. I wanted to legally and completely purchase Logan's $600,000 debt. Bradley's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before a sharp, predatory smile spread across his face. He understood exactly what I was doing. By buying the debt paper, the syndicate would get their cash immediately and walk away satisfied. But Logan would no longer owe money to a group of anonymous thugs in Nevada. The moment the wire transfer cleared, I would officially become my son-in-law's absolute ruthless creditor. I would own his debt, his future, and his entire life, and he would have absolutely no idea that the man he was trying to put in a mental asylum was the very man holding his financial leash. Bradley pulled up the necessary legal frameworks on his computer and began drafting the paperwork to form the LLC and initiate the debt transfer. He told me it would be finalized and legally binding by the end of the business day. While Bradley typed, my cell phone buzzed violently against the glass desk. I picked it up and saw a new text message on the screen. It was from Jasmine. The text was long, formal, and entirely devoid of any affection. She wrote that Logan's parents were hosting a lavish housewarming party at their newly rented luxury condo that afternoon. She explicitly stated that they expected me to attend, and more importantly, they expected me to bring the signed property deed transferring my home over to them. The final sentence of the text made the air in the room suddenly feel incredibly thin. Jasmine wrote that if I did not show up with the signed documents today, Logan and his mother were going straight to the courthouse tomorrow morning to formally file the emergency dementia papers and have me forcibly committed. My own flesh and blood, the daughter I had sacrificed 40 years of my life to protect, was actively participating in my extortion. I read the message twice to make sure I fully understood the depth of the betrayal. I did not reply. I simply stood up, adjusted my jacket, and told Bradley to finalize the debt purchase immediately. I was going to attend a housewarming party. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse level of the luxury high-rise building. The heavy bass of upbeat music vibrated through the polished marble floors. I stepped out into a massive open-concept living room packed with people wearing designer cocktail attire. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. This was the lavish housewarming party my son-in-law and his parents were throwing in a rented condominium. It was a spectacular display of fake wealth entirely funded by stolen money and crippling syndicate debt. I walked straight into the center of the room. I had deliberately chosen not to dress up for their little charade. I wore my heavy work boots, a pair of worn denim jeans, and my oldest plaid flannel shirt. The contrast between me and their high society guests was immediate and incredibly jarring. Conversations ground to a dead halt as people turned to stare at the old working-class man intruding on their elegant afternoon. Logan's mother spotted me from across the room. The fake, practiced smile on her face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic and intense disgust. She quickly set her crystal champagne glass down on a nearby table and marched toward me, her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She grabbed my arm tightly, her long acrylic nails digging sharply into my sleeve, and physically pulled me away from her wealthy friends. She leaned in close, her heavy floral perfume suffocating me, and hissed viciously through clenched teeth. She asked me what exactly I thought I was doing, showing up dressed like a homeless person to a highly exclusive networking event. I calmly looked her in the eye and told her I was officially invited by my daughter and I brought exactly what I was asked to bring. I patted the thick manila envelope tucked securely under my arm. Her eyes locked onto the envelope, glowing immediately with greedy anticipation. Instead of taking it from me, she pointed a sharp, commanding finger toward the back of the condo. She told me to go straight into the catering kitchen and wait completely out of sight. She explicitly ordered me not to speak to a single guest, claiming my embarrassing presence was a massive distraction to their important guests. She told me to sit quietly on the wooden stool next to the service elevator until Logan was ready to deal with me. I did not argue with her. I walked past the staring guests, pushed open the swinging wooden door, and entered the cramped, hot kitchen. I sat on the small wooden stool next to the industrial garbage cans, perfectly willing to play the obedient, defeated old man for just a few more minutes. I waited in the kitchen for barely 5 minutes before the swinging door burst violently open. Logan marched in, practically vibrating with arrogant energy. His parents followed closely behind him, hovering around his shoulders like vultures ready to pick a carcass clean. Logan wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He stood over me, looking down at my faded flannel shirt with absolute contempt. He held out his hand and snapped his fingers right in my face, demanding I hand over the signed house deed immediately. He boasted loudly that his new financial venture required immediate capital injection, and that my old wooden house was finally going to serve a useful, profitable purpose. His father crossed his arms across his chest and told me it was the smartest decision I had ever made in my miserable, underachieving life. I looked up at the three of them, studying the pure, unfiltered greed radiating from their flushed faces. I slowly reached under my arm and handed the thick manila envelope over to Logan. He snatched it aggressively from my hands. A smug, triumphant grin spread across his face. He looked back at his parents and proudly declared that he knew I would cave under the legal pressure. He eagerly ripped open the top of the envelope, expecting to see the legal property transfer, handing my life savings directly into his pockets. He pulled out the stack of crisp white papers. The triumphant smile on his face froze completely. He stared at the bold blue letterhead printed at the very top of the first page. It was absolutely not a property deed. It was an official, heavily stamped medical document from the chief of neurology at the most prestigious research hospital in the state. I had spent the entire morning undergoing a grueling, exhaustive battery of cognitive and psychological tests. The document Logan was holding was a freshly certified, legally binding psychiatric evaluation. It explicitly stated in plain, undeniable medical terms that my cognitive function was absolutely flawless. It declared that I was 100% mentally competent, fully capable of managing my own complex financial affairs, and showed absolutely zero signs of dementia or any other degenerative mental disease. Logan's mother peered over his shoulder to read the document, her face drained of all color, turning pale and sickly. I sat calmly on my stool and looked Logan right in the eye. I told him he could take his corrupt, bribed psychiatrist and his fake emergency guardianship application and throw them in the nearest trash can. I told him his primary point of leverage was completely dead, and I was never giving him the keys to my home. Logan's face turned a violent shade of dark purple. The vein in his neck bulged aggressively against his tight silk collar. He crushed the expensive certified medical evaluation in his fist, completely losing the polished corporate facade he had carefully maintained all afternoon. He threw the crumpled ball of papers hard against the stainless steel refrigerator and let out a string of vicious, hateful curses. Without saying another word to me, he spun around, kicked the kitchen door open, and stormed back out into the crowded party. His parents stood frozen in the kitchen, completely panicked, realizing their easy payday had just evaporated into thin air. A few moments later, the kitchen door flew open again. Logan dragged my daughter Jasmine into the room by her wrist. He pushed her forward, roughly closed the door forcefully behind them, and stood blocking the exit like a prison guard. He pointed a shaking finger at me and ordered Jasmine to fix the situation immediately. Jasmine looked at me, her eyes red, swollen, and puffy from crying. She was trembling from head to toe. She stepped toward me and fell to her knees right there on the hard tile floor. She grabbed my rough hands, her hot tears spilling over my calloused fingers. She begged me to stop being so stubborn and selfish. She pleaded with me to just sign the house over to Logan right now to make the pain stop. I stared at my daughter in absolute disbelief. I asked her why she was fighting so incredibly hard to make me homeless for a man who did not respect either of us. Jasmine let out a loud, desperate sob and dropped a bomb that made the room spin violently around me. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes and screamed that she was pregnant. She told me she was going to have a baby and that she desperately needed my financial help. She cried hysterically, claiming that Logan's business partners were ruthless, dangerous men. She said if Logan did not get the massive amount of money from my house to pay them back by the end of the week, the authorities would get involved and Logan would go straight to a federal prison. She gripped my flannel shirt tightly and told me that if I did not sign the deed today, I would be forcing my unborn grandchild to grow up without a father. She was actively weaponizing an unborn child to emotionally blackmail her own father. She was holding a knife directly to my heart, demanding I sacrifice my entire life and my dignity to save a degenerate, cheating gambler from his own catastrophic mistakes. The word pregnant echoed in the cramped hot kitchen like a gunshot. It completely disarmed me. I stood there looking down at my daughter as she wept on the hard tile floor, clinging to my flannel shirt. My anger instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating wave of shock and profound sadness. She believed she was carrying a child, and she believed the father of that child was going to be ripped away from her if I did not sacrifice my home. I could not stay in that room and fight a pregnant woman. I could not look at my own flesh and blood consumed by such intense manufactured terror and continue to argue. I gently pulled my hands away from her grip. I looked at Logan, who was standing by the door with a sickeningly triumphant smirk on his face, believing he had finally found the ultimate leverage to break me. I did not say a single word to him. I turned around, pushed past him, and walked completely out of the penthouse condo. I ignored the stares of the wealthy guests and the furious whispers of his parents as I rode the elevator down to the lobby. I drove back to my quiet wooden house in total silence. My heart was broken for my daughter, but my brain refused to shut down. I had spent 40 years working as a lead structural engineer. My entire career was built on analyzing data, finding hidden stress fractures, and demanding absolute verifiable proof before approving any project. Something about Jasmine's sudden confession felt structurally unsound. Logan was a degenerate gambling addict, a liar, and a desperate man backed into a corner by a violent syndicate. Would a man in that much immediate danger really decide to start a family? Or was this pregnancy just another carefully constructed pressure point designed entirely to break my resolve? I decided right then that I could not blindly trust the tears of a manipulated woman or the word of a known con artist. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I called Bradley. I told him I needed top-tier medical surveillance and absolute undeniable proof. Bradley immediately connected me with a premium private investigator. This investigator was a retired federal agent who specialized in corporate espionage and deep background medical checks for high-net-worth clients. I paid an exorbitant cash retainer to rush the job. I instructed the investigator to uncover every single piece of data regarding Jasmine's supposed pregnancy. I wanted to see the doctor visits, the pharmacy records, and the exact origin of her diagnosis. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made my next move. 2 days passed in agonizing heavy silence. I completely isolated myself inside my home, ignoring the dozens of frantic, emotionally manipulative text messages from my daughter and the threatening voicemails left by Logan's parents. On the morning of the third day, the private investigator arrived at my front door. He walked into my dining room and sat down at the exact same table where Logan had tried to force me to sign away my deed. The investigator did not offer any polite small talk. He opened a thick black leather folder, looked at me with a grim, hardened expression, and delivered the brutal facts. Jasmine was absolutely not pregnant. I sat back in my chair, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of the deception. I asked him how Jasmine, a highly intelligent medical resident who worked in a hospital every single day, could possibly be fooled about her own body and a fundamental medical condition. The investigator let out a heavy sigh and explained the truly sickening depths of Logan's psychological abuse. Logan had orchestrated an incredibly elaborate, deeply cruel gaslighting campaign. He had been secretly tampering with her daily vitamins, replacing them with unregulated hormone supplements he bought on the black market. These supplements were specifically designed to artificially simulate early pregnancy symptoms like severe morning sickness, hormonal mood swings, and extreme physical fatigue. When Jasmine finally felt sick enough to take a home pregnancy test, Logan eagerly volunteered to check the results, quietly swapping her negative test in the bathroom with a fake positive test he had purchased online. He then presented her with highly realistic forged ultrasound printouts that he bought from a custom novelty website. He claimed he had taken her early blood samples to a private exclusive concierge clinic for rapid analysis to surprise her with the good news. He deliberately isolated her from her own trusted colleagues at the hospital, insisting they strictly use his private doctor to maintain their high society privacy. That private doctor was actually just a hired actor who confidently confirmed the fake pregnancy over a brief low-quality video call. Logan engineered this entire phantom pregnancy for one single horrific purpose. He needed to weaponize Jasmine's maternal instinct and use her absolute terror of being a single mother as the ultimate crowbar to pry the house deed out of my hands. He was systematically destroying my daughter's mind just to pay off his debts. A mixture of immense relief and absolute murderous rage washed over me. I was relieved that my daughter was not actually tied to this monster for the rest of her life by a child, but the sheer depravity of his actions made my blood boil. Logan was not just a greedy thief or a desperate gambling addict. He was a vicious psychological predator who viewed my daughter as nothing more than a disposable tool. I looked across the table at the investigator and asked him if that was everything he had found. The investigator shook his head slowly. He reached into the very back flap of the thick black folder and pulled out a crisp, high-resolution, glossy photograph. He slid it face up across the polished wooden table toward me. The photograph showed Logan sitting outside a high-end coffee shop on the other side of the city. He was smiling warmly, holding hands across the small cafe table with a stunningly beautiful blonde woman. It was instantly clear to me that this was the exact same woman Logan had been frantically whispering to on the phone in the middle of the night while he was ransacking my bedroom. I stared intently at the image, my eyes drawn immediately to the woman's very obvious physical condition. She was wearing a tight maternity dress, and she was heavily, undeniably pregnant. The investigator tapped the photograph right next to Logan's smiling face with his index finger. He told me the woman's name was Erica. She was Logan's actual long-term girlfriend, a woman he had been secretly seeing since before he even married my daughter. The investigator looked me dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing piece of the puzzle. Erica was exactly 6 months pregnant with Logan's actual biological child. Logan was using Jasmine's fake medically induced phantom pregnancy to steal my life savings, specifically so he could pay off his violent syndicate debts and secure a wealthy future for his real family with his mistress. He planned to take my house, clear his name with the mob, and then abandon my daughter completely. I stared at the photograph of the smiling, pregnant mistress, and any lingering shred of mercy I had left in my heart vanished instantly. The gloves were permanently off. I slid the photograph of the pregnant mistress back across the table to the private investigator. The image of the smiling blonde woman carrying Logan's actual child burned itself permanently into my memory. I told the investigator his job was done and handed him a thick envelope of cash for his excellent and highly discreet services. The moment he walked out of my front door and his car disappeared down the quiet street, I picked up my phone and called Bradley. There was no more waiting patiently. There was no more playing defense against these absolute monsters. I told my corporate lawyer to pull the trigger on the financial guillotine immediately. Bradley did not hesitate for a single second. Within 30 minutes of my phone call, he initiated a massive, highly encrypted wire transfer moving exactly $600,000 from my hidden trust fund directly to the underground lending syndicate in Nevada. He executed the complex transaction through our newly formed, entirely anonymous limited liability company. The transaction was swift, incredibly clean, and completely untraceable back to me or my family. The violent men who had been aggressively threatening to break Logan's legs and ruin his life were officially paid off in full. They collected their cash, closed their heavy leather ledgers, and walked away entirely satisfied, severing all dangerous ties with my son-in-law. But Logan was absolutely not free. He was now securely locked in a much tighter, much more dangerous trap of my own design. By legally purchasing the syndicate debt paper, my anonymous corporate entity became his sole undisputed creditor. I now officially owned his massive financial liability. Unlike the Nevada syndicate, I did not just want my money back with a high interest rate. I wanted his absolute, undeniable destruction. I instructed Bradley to immediately draft the most aggressive, relentless debt collection notices legally permissible in the state. I wanted property liens meticulously prepared. I wanted asset seizure protocols activated immediately without any grace periods. I wanted the full crushing weight of the corporate legal system to bear down heavily on Logan and his arrogant parents, who had foolishly co-signed his original business loans to support his fake high society lifestyle. Bradley assured me the legal machinery was actively in motion and the steel trap would snap shut on their necks in a matter of days. I hung up the phone and poured myself a glass of cold water, feeling a chilling sense of absolute control. I had Logan exactly where I wanted him. While I was meticulously setting up his total financial ruin in the background, Logan was desperately scrambling to regain his footing in the real world. He had failed completely to secure the house deed at the lavish party, and he knew his Friday midnight deadline with the violent syndicate was rapidly approaching. He had absolutely no idea his massive debt had already been quietly sold to me. Driven by sheer panic and a complete lack of basic human morality, Logan decided to strike the lowest, most despicable blow imaginable. Since the fake medical guardianship application had failed to scare me into submission, he needed a brand new way to legally neutralize me and seize control of my valuable assets. He and his mother drove directly to the busy Metropolitan Hospital where my daughter was completing her grueling medical residency. They did not go there to comfort Jasmine or support her through her demanding clinical shifts. They went there to systematically destroy my reputation and isolate her from her peers. Logan marched right into the administrative offices and requested an emergency meeting with the residency director. He put on an award-winning performance, crying fake tears and shaking with manufactured fear. He and his mother began spreading vicious, highly damaging rumors to Jasmine's closest colleagues and clinical supervisors. They claimed I was suffering from severe undiagnosed schizophrenic episodes. They confidently told the hospital staff I was experiencing violent delusions, hoarding dangerous weapons in my house, and making active physical threats against my own supposedly pregnant daughter. Logan painted a terrifying, vivid picture of a deranged, dangerous old man who was a direct threat to the safety of everyone around him. His mother even fabricated a ridiculous story about me chasing them out of the house with a heavy steel hammer. Jasmine, deeply exhausted by her 80-hour hospital shifts and heavily manipulated by the fake pregnancy hormones Logan was secretly feeding her, was completely overwhelmed. When her own medical supervisors gently pulled her aside in the hospital corridor to express their deep concern for her physical safety, the carefully planted seeds of doubt took permanent root in her mind. Logan easily convinced her that I was completely out of my mind and that they needed to take extreme legal action immediately to protect her. That evening, I was sitting quietly at my kitchen table, carefully reviewing the final trust documents in the fading sunlight, when a heavy, authoritative pounding suddenly echoed through my wooden house. The aggressive knocks were loud enough to rattle the glass in the front window panes. I pushed my wooden chair back, walked to the front door, and pulled it open. Two large, fully uniformed city police officers stood firmly on my front porch, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy-duty belts. They did not offer a friendly greeting or ask how my evening was going. The taller officer stepped forward, his face incredibly stern and completely unreadable, and demanded I confirm my legal identity. When I told him I was Hollis, he pulled a thick stack of aggressively stamped legal documents from his metal clipboard and shoved them firmly against my chest. He coldly informed me that I had just been served with an emergency ex parte restraining order. My eyes scanned the bold black text printed on the front page. Logan had gone straight to a sympathetic local judge earlier that afternoon. He had used the vicious rumors he planted at the residency hospital and a sworn, entirely fabricated affidavit from Jasmine claiming she feared for her life. The legal document explicitly accused me of making terroristic threats and presenting an imminent danger of severe physical violence. Because it was an emergency protective order, the judge had granted it immediately without giving me any chance to defend myself in a courtroom or present my own evidence. The police officer looked me dead in the eye and delivered the final, truly devastating blow. He told me the strict court order dictated that I was legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of my daughter or her husband under penalty of immediate arrest. Furthermore, because Logan had successfully argued to the judge that my house was Jasmine's primary legal residence and necessary safe haven, the court had ordered my immediate physical removal from the property. The officer tapped his silver watch and told me I had exactly 10 minutes to pack a single small bag of essential clothing and basic toiletries. The two officers stepped inside my home, watching my every move as I walked to my bedroom to pack a small duffel bag. If I refused to voluntarily leave my own home within that time frame, they promised they would place me in heavy steel handcuffs and drag me directly to the county jail. I stood silently on my own front porch 10 minutes later, clutching the small bag and the restraining order in my hands. I watched the officers lock my own front door, realizing that my treacherous son-in-law had just successfully weaponized the justice system to physically throw me out into the cold street. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the heavy police cruiser pull away from the curb, its red and blue lights flashing against the quiet evening trees. The heavy deadbolt of my own front door was locked behind me, completely securing my home for the very people trying to destroy my life. I adjusted the strap of my small canvas duffel bag over my shoulder. Any normal man in my position would be entirely broken. A normal man would be frantically calling cheap motels, crying on the phone to confused friends, or preparing to sleep in the back of his truck in a dark parking lot. But I was not a normal man, and I was absolutely done pretending to be one. I walked over to my old battered pickup truck, threw the duffel bag onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. I did not drive toward the cheap run-down motels on the outskirts of town. I merged onto the highway and drove directly into the wealthy, glowing heart of the financial district. I pulled my dusty truck into the brightly lit valet circle of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The young valet attendant in a crisp uniform looked at my rusted bumper and faded flannel shirt with obvious confusion and slight disdain. I handed him the keys, grabbed my bag, and walked through the massive revolving glass doors. The lobby was a spectacular display of imported marble towering crystal chandeliers and soft piano music playing in the background. I walked straight up to the polished mahogany front desk. The elegant receptionist looked at me with a tight professional smile that clearly masked her immediate judgment. She politely asked if I was lost or looking for the service exit. I did not answer her insulting question. I reached into my worn leather wallet and pulled out the heavy, solid titanium black Centurion card that Corinne had left in the trust. I placed it flat on the cold marble counter. The receptionist stared at the highly exclusive black card, her eyes widening in absolute shock. I told her I required the presidential suite for an indefinite period of time and I wanted absolute privacy. Her entire demeanor shifted instantly from condescending dismissal to terrified respect. Within 3 minutes, she was personally escorting me to the private VIP elevator, nervously apologizing repeatedly for her initial hesitation. I stepped out onto the top floor and entered a sprawling multi-room penthouse suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire glittering city skyline. I threw my cheap canvas bag onto a $10,000 velvet sofa. The forced exile they thought would completely break my spirit had just placed me at the absolute top of the city. I walked over to the suite's fully stocked wet bar and poured myself a neat glass of incredibly expensive aged scotch. I carried the heavy crystal glass over to the sprawling leather sofa in the center of the living room and sat down. I opened my canvas bag, pulled out my high-performance laptop, and set it on the glass coffee table. When Logan and his parents first started making their condescending remarks months ago, my engineering instincts had immediately kicked in. I never left anything to chance, especially the security of the home I built. I had spent an entire weekend discreetly wiring my house with state-of-the-art microscopic security cameras. They were expertly hidden in the smoke detectors, the wooden bookshelves, and the living room wall clock, providing full high-definition video and crystal-clear audio of every single room. I took a slow sip of the burning scotch, typed in my complex encryption password, and opened the live surveillance feed. The screen flickered to life, showing the interior of my wooden house. The front door swung violently open. Logan marched inside carrying 2 large luxury suitcases. His mother and father followed right behind him, carrying heavy cardboard boxes and laughing loudly. They looked exactly like conquering invaders surveying a captured territory. Logan dropped his bags heavily on my hardwood floor and let out a triumphant shout, bragging to his parents that his brilliant legal maneuver had completely neutralized me. I watched with cold, silent fury as his mother walked directly over to the mantel above the fireplace. She picked up a beautiful silver-framed photograph of Corinne on our wedding day. She sneered at the picture, muttering viciously that the house desperately needed to be sterilized of all my depressing trash. Without a single ounce of hesitation or basic human decency, she tossed the silver frame directly into a black plastic garbage bag. The sound of the glass shattering against the floorboards echoed through the laptop speakers. Logan and his father began casually walking through my living room, pointing at my antique furniture and deciding which pieces they could sell online for quick cash. They were violently desecrating the sanctuary I had built with the love of my life. They were completely confident that I was rotting away in some miserable public shelter, entirely powerless to stop them. They had absolutely no idea I was sitting in a luxury penthouse suite watching their every single move in high definition. I continued to watch the live feed as Logan suddenly checked his expensive watch and told his parents to clean up the living room immediately. He announced that a very important guest was arriving in exactly 10 minutes. I leaned forward on the leather sofa, setting my glass of scotch down on the table. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway on the exterior camera feed. A sharp-dressed man carrying a thick leather portfolio walked up to my front door and rang the bell. Logan opened the door with a massive, charismatic smile and ushered the man inside. The audio feed picked up their conversation perfectly. Logan introduced the man to his parents as a premier real estate broker who specialized in rapid off-market property liquidations. The broker looked around my house, noting the solid oak floors and the custom architectural details I had built myself. He told Logan it was a highly desirable property, but the legal title needed to be completely clear for a rapid sale. Logan reached into his designer jacket and confidently handed the broker a thick legal document. I zoomed the camera feed in directly on the papers. Logan proudly declared that he held full legally binding power of attorney over my entire estate. He blatantly lied to the broker, claiming I had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown and was permanently locked away in a secure medical facility. He stated that as my legal guardian, he had the absolute right to liquidate my assets to cover my supposed expensive medical bills. The broker examined the forged document, completely satisfied by the fake notary stamp Logan had acquired. Logan then gave the broker his final desperate instruction. He demanded that the house be listed immediately as a cash-only sale priced significantly below market value to attract instant buyers. He explicitly stated that he needed the money deposited into his bank account by Friday afternoon, or the entire deal was off. He was orchestrating a desperate fire sale of my entire life's work to beat the syndicate's midnight deadline. I watched the broker shake Logan's hand and promised to bring an eager cash buyer to the house by tomorrow morning. My house was about to be sold right out from under me, and Logan was totally confident he had outsmarted everyone. I closed my laptop, the screen going entirely black. Logan desperately wanted a high-speed real estate transaction. He was going to get exactly what he wanted, but the buyer was going to be his absolute worst nightmare. I opened my phone and dialed Bradley's secure number before the sun had even fully risen over the city skyline. I did not bother apologizing for the early hour. When you pay a corporate law firm the kind of heavy retainer I did, they answer on the first ring, regardless of the time on the clock. Bradley answered with his usual crisp, highly alert tone. I quickly briefed him on exactly what I had witnessed on my hidden camera feed the previous night. I explained that Logan had successfully forged a comprehensive power of attorney document, falsely claiming I was permanently locked in a psychiatric ward. Logan was actively using that forged document to initiate an immediate cash fire sale of my home. He desperately needed the closing funds deposited into his bank account by Friday afternoon to pay off the massive syndicate debt he still foolishly believed he owed to the Nevada mob. Bradley let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed through the phone speaker. He told me Logan was practically begging us to completely destroy him. Bradley calmly explained the exact legal weapon we were going to deploy to stop the real estate sale dead in its tracks. It was called a lis pendens. It is a formal, publicly recorded notice of pending litigation against a piece of real estate. Bradley explained that the absolute second his paralegals filed that document with the county clerk, a massive red flag would be permanently attached to my property title. No legitimate real estate broker and absolutely no wealthy cash buyer would ever touch a house with a clouded title. It legally guarantees that anyone who buys the property assumes all the massive legal liabilities, financial liens, and potential lawsuits associated with it. I gave Bradley the explicit green light to execute the strike immediately. I wanted a total legal blockade placed securely around my home. Bradley assured me his team was already drafting the paperwork as we spoke. Within just 2 hours, the formal legal notice was officially filed and digitally recorded at the county courthouse. My house was now entirely unsellable to anyone. The trap was perfectly set, and I poured myself a fresh cup of dark coffee from the Sweets espresso machine, ready to watch Logan step right into the jaws of defeat. By 10 o'clock that morning, I was sitting back on the velvet sofa, my high-performance laptop open on the glass coffee table. The live surveillance feed from my living room was streaming in crystal-clear high definition. Logan was pacing back and forth across my hardwood floors, aggressively checking his expensive watch every few seconds. He had forced his parents to clean the entire ground floor, desperately trying to make my home look like a premium, flawless piece of real estate. Exactly at 10:15, the front doorbell rang. Logan practically sprinted to open it. The sharp-dressed real estate broker stepped inside, followed closely by a wealthy-looking older man wearing a tailored golf shirt. This was the eager cash buyer Logan was banking his entire life on. Logan put on his best charismatic smile, offering them bottled water and enthusiastically pointing out the custom architectural details I had spent years building with my own hands. The cash buyer nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by the solid construction and prime location. He turned to the broker and verbally agreed to the asking price, stating he could wire the funds by Thursday morning. Logan pumped his fist discreetly, his face glowing with absolute triumph. He thought he had just won the war. Then the broker's digital tablet chimed with a priority email notification. The broker opened his digital title search application to finalize the preliminary paperwork. I watched through the hidden camera as the broker's professional smile instantly vanished. He aggressively tapped his screen twice, his eyebrows furrowing in deep confusion and sudden alarm. The broker looked up from his tablet and stared directly at Logan with cold, hard anger. He firmly announced that the deal was completely dead. He bluntly informed the cash buyer that a massive lis pendens had just been slapped on the property title 2 hours ago by a major corporate law firm. The broker aggressively accused Logan of trying to rope him into a fraudulent sale and risk his professional real estate license. The cash buyer did not say a single word. He simply turned around and walked straight out the front door. The broker followed right behind him, slamming my heavy oak door shut. Logan stood in the center of the living room, completely paralyzed by absolute shock. Then the shock violently morphed into pure, unhinged rage. Logan threw his head back and let out a guttural scream. He picked up a heavy wooden dining chair and smashed it violently against the brick fireplace, shattering the wood into dozens of jagged pieces. He kicked the coffee table, sending magazines flying across the room, cursing my name at the top of his lungs. His parents ran into the room, terrified by his violent outburst. Logan was having a full catastrophic meltdown on camera, and I watched every single second of it. Logan was standing in the middle of the absolute wreckage he had just created, breathing heavily, his custom suit jacket wrinkled and covered in wooden splinters from the smashed chair. His mother was crying softly in the corner, begging him to calm down and explain why the wealthy buyer had suddenly walked out. Logan ignored her, completely running his shaking hands through his hair in a state of absolute sheer panic. He knew the Friday deadline was now a lethal brick wall he was going to crash into at full speed. While he was desperately trying to calculate his next impossible move, the loud, sharp chime of his cell phone pierced the tense silence in the room. Logan frantically yanked the phone out of his pocket, probably hoping it was the broker calling back to negotiate a compromise. It was not the broker. I watched his eyes lock onto the bright screen. It was an automated high-priority email notification. I knew exactly what that email contained because Bradley and I had meticulously drafted it just an hour prior. The email was officially sent from the anonymous limited liability company I now used to hold his massive debt. Logan opened the message and I watched the remaining color violently drain from his flushed face. He looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal medical diagnosis. The email stated in cold, uncompromising legal terms that his $600,000 debt was now officially in terminal default. Because the grace period had expired and the LLC had acquired the primary loan notes, we were exercising our absolute legal right to initiate immediate aggressive asset seizure. The document detailed exactly what was going to be taken from him. But the killing blow was the final paragraph. When Logan originally took out his massive business loans to fund his fake high society lifestyle and cover his gambling losses, his arrogant parents had foolishly co-signed the initial banking agreements as personal guarantors. The email explicitly informed Logan that the LLC was immediately freezing and garnishing his parents' entire retirement accounts and pension funds to cover the massive financial shortfall. Logan dropped his phone onto the hardwood floor, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His father stepped forward, his voice trembling with fear, and asked his son what the email said. Logan looked up at the two people who had enabled his arrogance his entire life. He realized he had not just destroyed his own future. He had just legally bankrupted his own parents. The camera feed from my living room captured the exact moment the devastating financial reality crashed down on Logan's parents. While Logan was still staring at the default email on his phone in a state of catatonic shock, his father's cell phone began to ring incessantly. It was a priority emergency call directly from their primary wealth management bank. His father answered the phone with a shaky voice, his face still pale from witnessing Logan's violent outburst with the wooden chair. I turned up the volume on my laptop to catch every single word echoing in my house. The senior bank representative on the other end of the line was not calling to offer a courtesy warning or discuss a missed payment. The representative coldly informed Logan's father that a massive corporate legal entity had just executed a hard, uncompromising freeze on all their financial assets. Every single penny in their joint checking accounts, their high-yield savings, and their decades of accumulated retirement pension funds was officially locked down under a heavy corporate garnishment order. Because they had proudly co-signed Logan's original massive business loans, tying their own secure financial future to his fake corporate hedge fund, they were now legally responsible for his catastrophic default. His father dropped the phone onto the hardwood floor, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process the horrifying fact that his entire life savings had just evaporated in a matter of seconds. He looked at Logan, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Then the terror rapidly and violently morphed into vicious, unhinged anger. He lunged forward, grabbing Logan by the lapels of his ruined designer jacket and slammed his own son hard against the brick fireplace. The loving, unconditionally supportive father act vanished completely. He screamed directly into Logan's face, demanding to know exactly what kind of illegal mess he had dragged them into. Logan's mother, who'd been crying softly in the corner just moments before, instantly turned on her son with equal ferocity. She shrieked that they were going to lose their beautiful suburban home and end up living on the street because of his reckless gambling and stupid, arrogant mistakes. She aggressively poked Logan in the chest, her sharp nails digging into his shirt, demanding he fix the massive disaster immediately. She did not care about the legalities or the ethics of the situation anymore. She ordered Logan to hunt me down, drag me out of whatever miserable gutter he thought I was hiding in, and force me to sign away my assets. She viciously demanded that Logan extract the money from the old man by any means necessary, even if he had to physically break my fingers to get the signature on the deed. The rats were officially trapped in the sinking ship, and they were beginning to violently tear each other apart just to survive. Logan was backed into an impossible corner, hyperventilating as his parents continued to scream at him in my living room. He shoved his father away and frantically pulled out his phone. I knew exactly what he was doing. During Jasmine's first year of medical school, I had insisted we share our GPS locations on a family tracking application just in case her car ever broke down during her late-night hospital shifts. In all the chaos of the fake medical guardianship and the emergency restraining order, I had deliberately chosen not to disable that tracking feature. I actively wanted them to find me. I watched on the camera feed as Logan dragged Jasmine into the living room, aggressively demanding she open the tracking app on her phone. Jasmine, looking exhausted and deeply confused by the brutal screaming match between Logan and his parents, complied with trembling hands. Logan looked at the glowing blue dot on her screen, fully expecting to see my location pinned to a cheap homeless shelter, a dangerous alleyway, or a public bus station on the bad side of town. Instead, he saw the GPS coordinates resting squarely on the most expensive piece of commercial real estate in the entire financial district. Less than 40 minutes later, I was standing in the opulent marble-covered lobby of the Ritz-Carlton. I had just finished an excellent steak dinner delivered by private room service, and decided to take a brief walk downstairs to grab a fresh newspaper. I was wearing a clean, perfectly tailored navy blazer I had purchased from the hotel's luxury boutique earlier that afternoon. The heavy gold doors of the VIP elevator slid open, and I stepped out into the bright lobby filled with the scent of fresh lilies and soft piano music. At that exact moment, the massive revolving glass doors at the front entrance were pushed violently open. Logan Jasmine and his furious parents barged right past the stunned valet attendants. They looked completely unhinged and frantic. Logan's silk tie was torn, his suit was a wrinkled mess covered in splinters, and his parents were red-faced and sweating heavily. They scanned the elegant lobby entirely out of place among the wealthy hotel guests sipping champagne. Then Logan's frantic eyes locked directly onto me. He stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at my tailored blazer, the expensive leather shoes on my feet, and the calm, completely relaxed expression on my face. The sheer cognitive dissonance practically short-circuited his brain. He had fully expected to find a broken, terrified old man begging for mercy in a gutter. Instead, he found me descending from a luxury penthouse suite, looking better, stronger, and more powerful than he ever had in his entire miserable life. Logan completely lost his grip on reality. The aggressive, arrogant, tough guy persona he had worn like an impenetrable shield for the past 2 years shattered into a million pieces right there on the polished marble floor. He sprinted across the lobby toward me, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the wealthy hotel guests. and the sudden alarmed movement of the hotel security guard stepping forward to intervene. He did not yell or threaten me with fake legal documents. Instead, his knees buckled entirely. Logan collapsed directly onto the hard floor at my feet. He grabbed the fabric of my tailored trousers, his face twisted in absolute pathetic agony. Genuine, desperate tears streamed down his cheeks, ruining his carefully groomed appearance. He begged me with a cracking, hysterical voice to lift the legal blockade on the house. He sobbed loudly, pleading with me to sell the property to the cash buyer immediately so he could access the funds. He finally confessed the ugly truth out loud, crying that the dangerous men he owed money to were going to kill him, and that his parents were going to lose their entire retirement fund if I did not save them right this second. He looked up at me, completely stripped of his pride, practically kissing my shoes in front of the entire hotel lobby. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward, gaslight my daughter with a fake pregnancy, and steal my life savings. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not reach down to help him stand up. I simply stared at him with absolute freezing cold indifference. Jasmine stood a few feet away, her hands covering her mouth in pure horror as she watched her supposedly brilliant, successful husband grovel on the floor like a beaten dog. But Logan's mother was not ready to surrender. The sight of me standing calmly in a luxury hotel, while her son begged on his knees, pushed her completely over the edge of sanity. She stomped heavily across the lobby, her face contorted in vicious, ugly rage. She pointed a sharp, shaking acrylic nail directly at my face. Her shrill voice echoed loudly off the crystal chandeliers as she screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding the attention of everyone in the room. She accused me of being a manipulative, worthless parasite. She shrieked that the only possible way I could afford to stay in a presidential suite was by taking out predatory illegal loans against the property that rightfully belonged to her son. She screamed her final delusional accusation for the entire lobby to hear, claiming I was actively stealing investment money from her brilliant boy just to live in a luxury hotel while his innocent family suffered. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the exact perfect bait for my final devastating trap. I let the echoes of her shrill voice fade into the shocked silence of the luxury lobby. Her delusional accusation was the absolute perfect cover story. I needed Logan to feel confident again, to believe he still had the upper hand, so he would willingly walk right into the final execution chamber tomorrow morning. I deliberately let my shoulders slump forward, instantly shedding the commanding posture I had held moments before. I looked down at the polished marble floor, perfectly playing the role of a deeply ashamed, broken old man. I let out a heavy, shaking sigh and told his mother she was entirely right. I lied smoothly, my voice trembling with manufactured defeat. I confessed that I had been absolutely terrified of sleeping on the cold streets after they threw me out of my own home. I claimed I had desperately reached out to a predatory, high-interest street lender to secure a massive cash advance just to pay for the presidential suite. I told them the interest was compounding daily and I was completely drowning in a financial mess I could not possibly escape. Logan stopped crying. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his eyes widening as he swallowed my lie whole. I looked directly at him and delivered the absolute surrender he was desperate to hear. I told him I was done fighting. I agreed to sell the house so he could pay off his dangerous syndicate debts and save his parents' retirement funds from being seized. But I firmly established two non-negotiable conditions. I told him I refused to sign away my life savings in my living room with some shady off-market real estate broker. I demanded we conduct the transaction with absolute legal transparency. I told him to meet me at the main branch of my primary bank downtown at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I said we would sign the deed transfer in the bank's secure conference room in front of an official bank manager. Then I pointed a rigid finger at his chest. I told him my second condition was absolute. I demanded he immediately call his lawyer and completely lift the fraudulent emergency restraining order. I stated that if the legal blockade keeping me from my daughter was not formally dissolved by tomorrow morning, I would not sign a single piece of paper, even if they begged me for 100 years. Logan scrambled to his feet, dusting off the knees of his ruined designer suit. The pathetic, weeping coward who had just been groveling on the floor vanished entirely in the blink of an eye. The familiar, sickeningly arrogant smirk crawled right back onto his face. He aggressively adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, completely convinced his aggressive tactics had finally broken my spirit. He eagerly agreed to my terms, boasting that he would have the restraining order dismissed within the hour. He sneered at me, calling me a foolish old man who should have just surrendered days ago, completely oblivious to the fact that he was enthusiastically agreeing to his own funeral arrangements. Without another word of gratitude or apology, he grabbed his mother by the arm and marched proudly out of the hotel lobby, dragging a silent, devastated Jasmine behind him. I took the private elevator back up to my penthouse suite, my expression instantly hardening back into cold resolve. I walked over to the wet bar, poured a fresh glass of water, and checked my encrypted cell phone. There was an urgent, secure message waiting for me from the premium private investigator I had hired. The investigator had successfully cloned Logan's mobile phone data the previous day during the background check. He was now intercepting every single text message and phone call Logan made in real time. The investigator forwarded a text message Logan had sent just 3 minutes after walking out of the Ritz-Carlton lobby. He had sent it directly to Erica, his secretly pregnant mistress. I read the intercepted message, the sheer malice of his words confirming every terrible thing I knew about him. Logan wrote that the stubborn old fool had finally caved under the pressure. He promised Erica he was getting the house deed signed at the bank tomorrow morning. But the final sentence was a masterclass in pure, unfiltered evil. Logan typed that the absolute second the cash cleared the bank, he was permanently dumping Jasmine, kicking her out onto the street, and having his private contacts drag me into a locked psychiatric ward by noon. He told his mistress to start packing her bags for their new wealthy life together. He thought he had outsmarted everyone, but his digital confession was now securely saved on my hard drive, ready to be deployed. It was past 2 o'clock in the morning. The city outside my floor-to-ceiling windows was quiet and dark. I was sitting at the glass dining table in the suite, meticulously organizing the massive stack of $18 million trust fund ledgers, the default notices, and the forged medical documents into a single devastating portfolio. The trap was perfectly armed. Suddenly, a faint, incredibly soft rustling sound broke the absolute silence of the room. It was coming from the heavy wooden door leading out to the penthouse hallway. I stood up silently and walked across the thick carpet. I saw a small white envelope slowly sliding underneath the door gap, pushed by a trembling hand. I waited until the footsteps in the hallway quickly faded into the distance before I pulled the door open. The hallway was completely empty. I picked up the plain white envelope and tore it open. Inside was a one-way first-class plane ticket to a city completely across the country, departing at 6 o'clock this morning. Tucked behind the ticket was a piece of hotel stationery with a hastily scribbled, tear-stained note. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Jasmine. She had somehow managed to sneak out of the house in the middle of the night and track me down alone. I unfolded the paper and read the desperate warning my daughter had risked everything to deliver. She wrote that I needed to take the ticket and run as far away as possible before the sun came up. She confessed that Logan had completely lied to me in the lobby. She wrote that he had no intention of letting me walk away freely after the bank meeting. Jasmine warned me that Logan had already hired 2 massive men from an unlicensed private psychiatric transport company. She stated they were going to be waiting in an unmarked van in the back alley behind the bank. Her note ended with a terrifying guarantee. The absolute second I signed the property deed, Logan was going to signal those men to rush into the bank, physically restrain me, and disappear me into a locked facility where no one would ever find me. I stared at the tear-stained note. It was a tiny, desperate spark of redemption from a daughter who had finally woken up to the horrifying reality of the monster she had married. She was trying to save my life. I carefully folded the note and placed it securely inside my suit jacket pocket. I was absolutely not going to run. I was going to walk directly into the bank downtown, look those kidnappers right in the eye, and burn Logan's entire world to the ground. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the polished marble floors of the bank's downtown main branch. The VIP conference room was located on the top floor, far away from the regular tellers and everyday customers. It was a massive room built entirely of thick, soundproof glass and dark mahogany wood, designed specifically for high-net-worth clients to conduct massive financial transactions in absolute privacy. Sitting around the expensive conference table were the people who believed they were about to steal my entire life. Logan sat at the very head of the table wearing a brand-new, sharply tailored charcoal suit. He looked incredibly relaxed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with a sickeningly arrogant, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. Beside him sat his parents, looking equally smug and dressed in their absolute finest country club attire. They were actively whispering to each other, already debating how quickly they could liquidate my antique furniture and exactly which luxury cruise they were going to book the absolute second my cash hit their bank accounts. Sitting nervously at the far end of the table was the exact same corrupt notary Logan had dragged into my living room days earlier. The heavy leather briefcase was resting on the floor next to him, but the most dangerous item in the room was resting directly in the center of the mahogany table. It was the forged emergency medical guardianship application, the fake psychiatric order claiming I had severe dementia. Logan had placed it there deliberately as a silent physical threat. It was his leverage, his guarantee that if I hesitated for even a single second to sign the house deed, he would immediately deploy his backup plan. I knew for a fact he had already put that vicious backup plan into motion. While his parents discussed their upcoming luxury vacations, Logan kept checking his expensive watch and glancing out the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the narrow back alley behind the bank. Thanks to my daughter's midnight warning, I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was checking on the unmarked white van idling in the alleyway. Inside that van were the two massive, unlicensed private psychiatric enforcers he had hired with his remaining stolen cash. Logan fully intended to take my signature, secure the house, and then signal those thugs to rush into the bank lobby, physically restrain me, and drag me out the back door to a locked facility before I could even scream for help. He thought he had engineered the absolute perfect crime. He believed he was the smartest man in the city, the apex predator waiting patiently for his wounded prey to walk directly into the snare. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the VIP conference room swung open. I did not walk in looking like a broken, defeated old man. I walked into the room standing perfectly straight, wearing my perfectly tailored navy blazer and a crisp white shirt. The arrogant smirk on Logan's face instantly faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. He had expected me to shuffle in with my head bowed, trembling with fear. But my posture was not the only thing that shocked him. I was absolutely not alone. Walking directly to my right was Bradley, my ruthless corporate attorney, carrying a thick leather briefcase and wearing a custom suit that made Logan's outfit look incredibly cheap. Walking to my left was the senior bank manager of the entire downtown branch, a man who possessed immense financial authority and demanded absolute respect. But the final two people who stepped into the room completely sucked the air out of Logan's lungs. Two fully uniformed, heavily armed city police officers walked in right behind us. They stepped inside, firmly pulled the heavy glass doors shut, and stood directly in front of the exit, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Logan jumped up from his leather chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed loudly against the glass wall. His parents gasped, clutching the edge of the mahogany table in sudden terror. The corrupt notary instantly turned pale white, his eyes darting frantically toward the door, realizing he was suddenly trapped in a room with law enforcement. Logan tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. He pointed a shaking finger at me and forced a fake, nervous laugh. He looked at the police officers and arrogantly claimed he was incredibly glad they were there. He loudly declared that I was a deeply disturbed, violent schizophrenic and that they were right on time to help him safely transport me to a medical facility. He reached for the forged psychiatric order on the table, eager to present his fake evidence. But the police officers did not move an inch. They did not look at me with suspicion. They kept their cold, hardened eyes locked directly on Logan. Bradley stepped forward, pulled out a leather chair for me, and I sat down directly across from my son-in-law. The senior bank manager walked to the head of the table, his face a mask of absolute, uncompromising professional severity. Logan's arrogant facade began to crack completely. He looked at the manager, then at Bradley, and finally at me, his voice trembling as he demanded to know what was going on and why my lawyer was present for a simple real estate transfer. Logan desperately tried to force his original plan forward, completely ignoring the mounting disaster surrounding him. He aggressively pushed the single sheet of paper containing the house deed transfer directly across the polished wood toward me. He slapped a heavy silver pen down next to it. He leaned over the table, his eyes wide and frantic, and ordered me to sign the paper immediately so we could all walk away cleanly. He tapped his finger hard against the forged medical guardianship order lying next to the deed, reminding me of his vicious threat. He hissed under his breath that the men in the van were waiting downstairs and my time was officially up. I did not pick up the silver pen. I did not even look at the property deed. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and gave him a slow, chilling smile. The senior bank manager stepped right in front of Logan, physically blocking his view of me. The manager did not hand Logan the property deed. Instead, he reached into his own leather portfolio and pulled out a massive 2-inch thick binder filled with heavily stamped legal documents. He did not slide the binder to Logan. He slid it directly across the table to Logan's parents. The heavy binder hit the mahogany wood with a loud, terrifying thud. Logan's father looked down at the documents, his face turning the color of wet ash. The bank manager looked at the older couple with absolute freezing professional detachment. He announced in a loud, clear voice that echoed off the glass walls. He stated firmly that on behalf of the massive corporate limited liability company that currently owned their primary debt, he was officially serving them with a comprehensive foreclosure portfolio. He explicitly informed Mr. and Mrs. Hayes that because their son had severely defaulted on his $600,000 underground loan, and because they had foolishly signed as personal guarantors, the bank was executing an immediate total asset seizure. The manager listed their losses without a single shred of mercy. He stated that their primary suburban residence was legally seized. Their decades of accumulated retirement pensions were permanently frozen, and their joint checking accounts were entirely garnished as of 8 o'clock this morning. Logan's mother let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. She grabbed her chest, hyperventilating as she realized she was officially bankrupt and homeless. His father covered his face with his hands, sobbing uncontrollably right there in the boardroom. Logan staggered backward, his legs hitting the edge of his fallen chair. He looked like he had just been hit by a speeding freight train. He looked at the bank manager's spit flying from his lips in pure, unhinged panic. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know who had authorized this massive corporate takeover. He yelled frantically that he owed money to the Nevada syndicate, not some random corporate bank. He pounded his fists on the table, screaming, "What LLC is doing this to me? Tell me what LLC bought my debt." I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany table. I looked past the bank manager, locking my eyes directly onto Logan's terrified, desperate face. I kept my voice incredibly low, calm, and absolutely lethal. I looked him dead in the eye and said mine. The single word hung in the cold air of the VIP conference room like a heavy executioner's blade. Logan stared at me, his eyes darting frantically back and forth as his brain completely failed to process the reality of the situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Bradley did not give him a single second to recover. My attorney stepped forward, set his heavy leather briefcase on the mahogany table, and pulled out a sleek silver remote. He pointed it directly at the ceiling, and the room's automatic blackout blinds smoothly descended, plunging us into a dramatic theater-like darkness. A massive projector screen unrolled silently from the ceiling directly behind the bank manager. Bradley pressed a button on his remote, and a blindingly crisp, high-definition image illuminated the entire room. It was not a slide presentation or a legal brief. It was the master financial ledger of the irrevocable trust fund Corinne had left me. The numbers projected on the screen were so massively large they almost looked fake to someone who had never seen real wealth. The bold black font at the very top of the document clearly displayed the name of the trust, followed immediately by the verified liquid cash balance. $18 million. Beneath that staggering figure was a meticulous, heavily detailed breakdown of our corporate acquisitions, the ongoing medical software patent royalties, and the exact ownership structure of the anonymous limited liability company that had just aggressively swallowed Logan's entire $600,000 syndicate debt. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair and watched the brilliant blue light from the projector wash over the faces of the people who had spent the last 2 years treating me like absolute garbage. The color completely drained from Logan's parents. His mother, the woman who had demanded I sit on a wooden stool by the garbage cans at her fake high society party, looked like all the blood had just been vacuumed out of her veins. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes locked onto the $18 million figure. His father gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. The profound, humiliating realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The old man they had relentlessly bullied, the man they had mocked for wearing flannel shirts and driving a rusted truck, the man they tried to lock in a dark basement to steal a simple wooden house, could literally buy and sell their entire bloodline with his pocket change. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Then the psychological dam broke completely. Logan's parents did what cowardly parasites always do when they are finally cornered by true power. They instantly folded. His mother burst into loud, dramatic tears. The vicious, arrogant woman who had threatened to throw my late wife's pictures into the trash just 24 hours ago suddenly threw herself forward across the mahogany table. She reached out with her shaking hands, desperately trying to grab my tailored sleeve. She wailed at the top of her lungs, her voice dripping with fake, sickening affection. She cried out my name, begging me to understand that this was all a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. She shrieked that we were a family, that she had always loved me like a brother, and that she had never actually wanted to hurt me. She blamed the entire situation on the intense stress of the wedding and her desperate desire to see our children succeed. Her husband was right behind her in the pathetic display of ultimate betrayal. Logan's father, the man who had proudly backed every single one of his son's arrogant moves, instantly turned on his own flesh and blood to save his own skin. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Logan and practically screamed his confession to the police officer standing by the door. He swore loudly that he had absolutely no idea Logan was involved with an illegal underground lending syndicate. He claimed Logan had completely lied to them about the corporate hedge fund and had forged their signatures on the original loan guarantees. He begged the bank manager to reverse the asset seizure, sobbing that they were innocent victims of their own son's sociopathic greed. I did not move a single muscle. I did not pull my arm away from his mother's reaching hands, nor did I offer a single word of comfort or acknowledgement. I remained absolutely, terrifyingly silent. I simply sat back in my chair and let them humiliate themselves in front of the senior banking staff and the armed city police. I watched them strip away every last ounce of their own dignity, weeping and groveling over the massive pile of money they suddenly realized they could never touch. Their tears meant absolutely nothing to me. It was a spectacular, beautiful display of total moral bankruptcy. While his parents wept and begged for financial mercy, Logan remained entirely frozen in his chair. He was staring at the glowing $18 million balance on the projector screen, his mind completely snapping under the immense weight of his own catastrophic failure. The money he had desperately needed to save his life and fund his fake reality with his pregnant mistress had been sitting right in front of him the entire time. He had ruined his marriage, bankrupted his parents, and committed multiple federal felonies to steal a modest house from a man who was secretly a multimillionaire. But Logan was a malignant narcissist. His massive ego simply could not process a total humiliating defeat. The sheer panic in his chest violently morphed back into manic, unhinged aggression. He suddenly slammed his hands flat on the table, pushing himself up so violently his chair crashed to the floor. He refused to lose. He leaned across the table, his face flushed dark red and completely covered in a slick layer of sweat. He lunged forward and grabbed the single sheet of paper resting in the center of the table. It was the forged emergency medical guardianship application, the document signed by his corrupt, bribed psychiatrist. He held the fake order up in the air, waving it around like a loaded weapon. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure manic desperation. He pointed the paper directly at the bank manager and loudly declared that the $18 million trust fund legally belonged under his absolute control. He shrieked that I was a medically diagnosed schizophrenic suffering from severe advanced dementia. He pounded his fist on the table and screamed that he was my legally appointed medical proxy and my primary guardian. He aggressively ordered the bank manager to immediately freeze all of my accounts, dissolve the LLC, and transfer total administrative control of the wealth directly into his name. The bank manager simply stared at him, completely unbothered by the screaming fit, but Logan was entirely out of control. He pulled his expensive cell phone from his suit pocket with shaking hands. He declared to the entire room that he was calling the chief psychiatrist right this very second to verbally authorize the immediate medical lockdown of my assets. He confidently threatened that the doctor would confirm his total legal authority, and then he would have the psychiatric transport team waiting in the alley drag me out of the building in a straitjacket. Logan slammed his phone down onto the center of the glass table and hit the speakerphone button. He dialed the corrupt doctor's private number, his chest heaving with manic adrenaline. He glared at me across the table with a look of pure psychotic triumph, fully believing his ultimate trump card was about to save his life. The loud electronic ringing of the speakerphone echoed sharply against the glass walls of the boardroom. It rang once. It rang twice. Logan stood there holding his breath, waiting to execute the final devastating move of his master plan right in front of the police. The phone rang a third time, the electronic tones slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom. On the fourth ring, the line finally clicked open. Logan leaned over the glass table, a victorious sneer spreading across his face, fully prepared to command his hired medical mercenary to lock away my entire life. But the voice that echoed through the speaker was not the smooth, practiced tone of a high-society concierge psychiatrist. It was a deep, hardened voice backed by the chaotic sounds of heavy footsteps and radio static. The voice firmly identified itself as an acting special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Logan froze his hand, hovering over the phone as if it had suddenly caught fire. He stammered, demanding to speak to the doctor, immediately claiming he had an emergency medical proxy to authorize right this second. The federal agent on the other end of the line let out a sharp, humorless scoff. He informed Logan that the doctor was currently sitting in the back of an armored transport vehicle in federal handcuffs. Bradley stepped forward, adjusting his expensive tie, and gave Logan a cold, predatory smile. While I was setting up the financial trap the previous day, Bradley had quietly taken the forged medical guardianship papers and the audio recordings of Logan's midnight break indirectly to his contacts at the federal prosecutor's office. A heavily armed federal strike team had raided the corrupt psychiatrist's lavish suburban estate at dawn. They seized his computers, his private patient ledgers, and his hidden offshore bank accounts. The agent on the speakerphone officially announced that the doctor was facing dozens of federal charges for massive medical fraud, accepting illegal bribes to falsify psychiatric evaluations, and participating in a highly organized extortion ring. The ultimate trump card Logan had banked his entire life on was completely dead. The federal agent then addressed the room, directly asking if Bradley was present on the line. Bradley confirmed he was. The agent stated that based on the seized digital evidence and text messages recovered from the doctor's phone, they had officially issued a federal arrest warrant for Logan Hayes. The two uniformed city police officers standing by the boardroom doors instantly unclipped their heavy handcuffs and stepped forward. Logan stared at his phone in absolute paralyzing horror. The device he thought would seal my fate had just become the instrument of his own total destruction. He reached out with a trembling hand and hit the end call button, severing the connection. But the devastating reality of the situation remained permanently locked in the room with him. I did not let him catch his breath. The financial ruin and the impending federal prison sentence were only the beginning of his punishment. It was time to completely sever the psychological chains he had wrapped around my daughter. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored navy blazer and pulled out the thick black folder the private investigator had handed me the day before. I placed it flat on the mahogany table. I did not look at Logan or his weeping parents. I looked directly at Jasmine. She was standing near the back wall, her face pale and her eyes wide with total confusion as she tried to process the revelation of my hidden wealth and her husband's criminal syndicate debts. I pushed the heavy black folder across the polished wood. It slid to a stop right at the edge of the table directly in front of her. I told her in a soft, steady voice to open it and finally meet the true monster she had married. Jasmine approached the table with shaking hands. She flipped open the heavy leather cover. The first thing she saw was the stack of highly realistic ultrasound printouts Logan had given her. Right next to them, stapled securely by the investigator, were the digital receipts from the Novelty Joke website where Logan had purchased them for $20. Jasmine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She frantically flipped to the next page. Staring back at her was the crisp, high-resolution photograph of Logan sitting at the sunny cafe holding hands across the table with Erica. The blonde woman's heavily pregnant stomach was impossible to ignore. Jasmine let out a choked, devastated sob as she recognized the truth. I watched her read the final page of the dossier. It was a printed transcript of the intercepted text messages Logan had sent to his mistress just hours ago. Jasmine read the exact words her husband had typed, promising to permanently dump her on the street the absolute second my house was sold. She read his vicious plan to have two unlicensed thugs drag me out the back door of this very bank and lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. The illusion of her loving, ambitious husband shattered into a million jagged pieces. The phantom pregnancy, the gaslighting, the emotional manipulation, it was all laid bare in undeniable black and white evidence. Logan had not just betrayed her financially. He had systematically violated her mind and her body, secretly feeding her unregulated black market hormones just to simulate a pregnancy to steal from her own father. The devastating sorrow on Jasmine's face vanished in a fraction of a second. It was instantly replaced by a blinding white-hot fury. She dropped the black folder onto the table and turned to face Logan. He raised his hands defensively, backing away from her, his charismatic mask completely melted away. He stammered frantically, claiming the photos were photoshopped, that the text messages were completely fake, and that I was still trying to manipulate her to ruin their beautiful marriage. He tried to reach out and touch her shoulder, begging her to believe him. Jasmine did not say a single word. She stepped forward, planted her feet firmly on the marble floor, and swung her right arm with every single ounce of strength she possessed in her body. The slap echoed through the soundproof glass boardroom like a thunderclap. It struck Logan directly across his jaw, snapping his head violently to the side. The force of the blow sent him staggering backward into his weeping father. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his pale cheek. He touched his face, looking at my daughter with absolute shock. Jasmine stared right through him, her eyes burning with pure hatred. The two uniformed police officers took another heavy step forward, ordering Logan to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs being readied broke Logan's final mental barrier. The sheer terror of spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, medical forgery, and conspiracy short-circuited his brain. The animal instinct to survive completely took over. He spun around, desperate to escape the boardroom before the officers could grab him. His mother was standing directly in his path, sobbing hysterically and reaching out for her brilliant boy. Logan did not hesitate. He shoved his own mother violently in the chest, sending her crashing hard into the heavy glass wall. He used the brief moment of absolute chaos to lunge forward, sprinting past the stunned bank manager and the terrified notary. He hit the heavy glass doors of the VIP room with his shoulder bursting out into the main hallway. He abandoned his parents, his wife, and his entire life in a fraction of a second, sprinting desperately for the main bank exit to save himself. Logan burst through the heavy glass doors of the bank and stumbled onto the busy downtown sidewalk. He completely ignored the shouts of the bank manager and the police officers echoing behind him. The primal, animalistic instinct to survive completely hijacked his brain. He knew the FBI strike team was likely already coordinating with local law enforcement to track him down. He knew his parents were financially ruined and his wife was done with him. His fake high society life was completely over, but he still had one final desperate card left to play. He was a senior broker at a boutique financial firm located just 4 blocks away in the heart of the financial district. He personally managed millions of dollars in liquid assets for wealthy hands-off clients. His twisted mind immediately formulated a new plan. If he could just get to his secure work terminal before the authorities flagged his corporate credentials, he could siphon enough untraceable funds into an offshore cryptocurrency wallet to buy a brand new identity and disappear to South America forever. He did not care that he would be stealing the life savings of innocent people. He did not care about the catastrophic damage he would leave behind. He only cared about saving his own skin. He sprinted down the crowded sidewalk, shoving aggressively past pedestrians and completely ignoring the blaring horns of the city traffic. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his ruined, splinter-covered designer suit. His lungs burned, but the sheer terror of spending decades in a federal penitentiary kept his legs moving. He reached the towering glass skyscraper that housed his brokerage firm. He practically threw himself through the revolving doors and ran straight for the security turnstiles. His hands shook violently as he fumbled for his corporate ID badge. He slapped the badge against the scanner, holding his breath until the small light flashed green and the glass barriers parted. He rushed into the elevator, frantically mashing the button for the 42nd floor. As the elevator shot upward, he desperately tried to make himself look presentable. He smoothed down his messy hair, wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, and attempted to straighten his torn silk tie. He needed to look completely normal for just 5 short minutes to avoid raising any suspicion from his colleagues on the trading floor. The elevator bell dinged and the doors slid open. The trading floor was its usual bustling, noisy environment, filled with brokers shouting into headsets and staring at scrolling market tickers. Logan kept his head down, walking as fast as he casually could toward his private corner office. He slipped inside, slammed the heavy glass door shut behind him, and locked the deadbolt. Logan threw himself into his expensive leather desk chair and violently shook his computer mouse to wake up his massive dual monitors. His fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard, aggressively typing in his high-level administrative credentials to bypass the standard security protocols. He accessed the firm's master client ledger, his eyes darting frantically across the screen as he searched for the perfect targets. He quickly located 3 dormant accounts belonging to elderly investors who rarely checked their portfolios. He rapidly drafted a massive wire transfer, consolidating exactly $2.5 million from their accounts into a single outgoing payment. He routed the massive sum toward a secure, untraceable shell company he had set up years ago in the Cayman Islands, specifically for emergencies like this. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He only needed to click the final execution button, and he would be a millionaire living on a tropical beach far away from the mess he had created. He took a deep, shaking breath, visualizing his escape, and slammed his index finger down on the mouse to execute the illegal transfer. The computer screen instantly froze. The small blue loading circle spun in the center of the monitor for 3 agonizing seconds. Logan leaned closer to the screen, whispering frantic prayers under his breath, begging the system to push the money through. Then both of his monitors flashed a violent, blinding shade of red. The complex trading software vanished entirely. A massive, bold warning message dominated the screens in stark white text. It read, "Access denied. Authorization required by majority shareholder." Logan stared at the glowing red screens, his blood running completely cold. He mashed his keyboard with his fists. He clicked the mouse frantically, trying to forcefully exit the warning screen and reboot the terminal. The red screen remained locked perfectly in place. Total panic consumed him. He grabbed his desk phone, intending to scream at the IT department and demand they fix what he assumed was a catastrophic server error so he could steal his client's money. But when he pressed the receiver to his ear, the line was completely dead. There was no dial tone, no static, absolutely nothing. He dropped the phone back onto its cradle. A terrifying realization began to creep into the back of his mind. He slowly turned his head and looked through the glass walls of his private office out onto the main trading floor. The room was no longer bustling or noisy. Every single broker, analyst, and assistant had stopped working. They were all standing in total silence, staring directly at his locked glass office. At the far end of the silent trading floor, the heavy frosted glass doors of the managing director's corner suite slid slowly open. Logan pressed his hands against his own glass wall, his eyes wide with absolute horror as he watched the scene unfold. I walked calmly out of that corner suite, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored navy blazer. Bradley walked directly behind me, holding a fresh stack of heavy corporate documents. Over the last 48 hours, while Logan was busy renting a fake luxury condo and planting vicious rumors at my daughter's hospital, Bradley and I had been working around the clock. I had instructed my ruthless attorney to use the massive liquid capital from my $18 million trust fund to aggressively approach the founding partners of this exact boutique brokerage firm. We offered them an incredibly lucrative all-cash buyout that they simply could not refuse. I had quietly and completely acquired a 51% controlling interest in the company. I officially owned the entire brokerage firm, the building lease, and every single computer on that floor. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the trading floor. The seasoned financial brokers immediately stepped back, parting like the Red Sea to let the new majority shareholder pass. I did not rush. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who held all the cards. I stopped right outside Logan's locked glass office. He backed away from the window, stumbling over his own desk chair, looking at me as if I were the Grim Reaper himself. I did not bother raising my voice or putting on a dramatic display for the employees. I spoke in a calm, authoritative tone that carried perfectly through the silent room and penetrated the thick glass of his office. I told him his trading terminal was permanently locked because I had personally ordered the IT department to revoke his security clearance 20 minutes ago. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the absolute final blow. I said, "You are fired, Logan. Effective immediately for gross misconduct, massive syndicate debt liabilities, and attempted corporate embezzlement." Logan slumped heavily against the wall, his legs finally giving out completely. He slid down to the floor, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his total annihilation finally crushed him. I leaned slightly closer to the glass pane and told him he did not even have the option of running away this time. I instructed him to look past my shoulder toward the main elevator banks at the entrance of the trading floor. The silver elevator doors chimed and slid open. 2 stern men wearing dark federal suits and carrying heavy briefcases stepped onto the floor. I informed Logan that the Securities and Exchange Commission auditors had just arrived. I told him they had already been granted full, unrestricted access to his entire fraudulent trading history and the illegal offshore transfer he had just attempted to make. I straightened my posture and added one last detail. I told him the FBI agents he had run away from at the bank were in the second elevator car, coming up right behind the auditors to finish the job. The absolute masterpiece of his destruction was finally complete. The 2 federal agents stepped off the elevator and walked directly across the silent trading floor. They did not announce themselves or ask for permission to enter the locked office. One of the agents simply produced a heavy steel baton and shattered the glass handle of Logan's door, reaching in to unlock the deadbolt from the inside. Logan did not fight back. The sheer magnitude of his defeat had completely drained the life from his body. He remained slumped against the wall as the agents hauled him to his feet, forcefully twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the heavy federal handcuffs echoed loudly through the completely silent room. The agents dragged him out of the office and marched him straight down the center aisle of the trading floor. Every single one of his former colleagues, the people he had arrogantly boasted to just hours earlier, watched in absolute disgust as he was subjected to the ultimate professional humiliation. Logan kept his eyes glued to the carpet, unable to look at me or anyone else as the elevator doors closed, sealing his fate. While Logan was being aggressively processed in a subterranean federal holding cell downtown, the devastating consequences of his actions were violently crashing down on his parents. Bradley had not wasted a single second after the bank meeting. The corporate legal machinery of the LLC moved with terrifying, uncompromising speed. By early afternoon, 2 county sheriff deputies arrived at the pristine suburban home of Logan's parents. They carried a stack of finalized eviction notices and an immediate asset seizure warrant. Logan's parents were completely hysterical, weeping on their manicured front lawn as the deputies officially forced them out of the house they had lived in for 20 years. They were not allowed to pack moving trucks or hire professional services. They were given exactly 30 minutes to fill whatever cheap suitcases they could carry with their own 2 hands before the heavy padlocks were permanently snapped onto their front doors. They had proudly co-signed their son's massive fraudulent business loans, completely blinded by their own greed and arrogance, and now the bill had officially come due. Late that evening, I was sitting comfortably in my own living room. The heavy rain had just begun to beat against the glass windows of the wooden house I built. The doorbell rang with a series of frantic, desperate pushes. I walked to the front door and pulled it open. Standing on my porch, shivering in the cold rain and clutching 2 cheap plastic suitcases, were Logan's parents. They looked absolutely pathetic. Their expensive country club clothing was soaked and clinging to their skin. The arrogant sneers they had worn so proudly just yesterday were completely gone. Logan's mother fell to her knees the absolute second the door opened. She looked up at me with mascara running down her face in thick black streams. She begged me for mercy, sobbing that they had absolutely nowhere else to go. She pleaded with me to let them sleep in my unfinished basement. The delicious poetic irony of her request was staggering. This was the exact same woman who had viciously demanded I be locked away in a dark basement to make room for her high society lifestyle. Now she was kneeling in the freezing rain, desperately begging to live in the dirt and shadows she had designed for me. I looked down at her and her weeping husband. I told them my house was completely sterilized of all depressing trash, using the exact words she had used when she threw my late wife's photograph away. Without another word, I stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door directly in their faces, locking the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. The legal fallout for Logan was absolute and inescapable. Because the federal prosecutors possessed the cloned hard drives, the intercepted text messages, and the audio recordings of him admitting his ties to the violent underground syndicate, they did not offer him a single plea deal. During his preliminary arraignment, the federal judge took one look at the sheer volume of his crimes and immediately denied bail, citing him as an extreme flight risk. Logan was officially charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, corporate embezzlement, and the highly serious federal crime of medical forgery. The legal experts Bradley consulted guaranteed that Logan would face a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His life was entirely over before he even reached his 33rd birthday. But the absolute most devastating blow to Logan's massive ego did not come from a judge or a lawyer. It came from the very woman he had destroyed everything to protect. Sitting in his miserable concrete holding cell, Logan used his one allowed phone call to frantically dial Erica, his secretly pregnant mistress. He desperately needed to tell her to access his hidden emergency cash reserves and hire a premium defense attorney. He listened to the phone ring, gripping the plastic receiver with shaking hands. The call went straight to a disconnected automated voicemail. Erica was an opportunistic parasite, and the moment she saw the local evening news broadcast featuring her wealthy boyfriend being dragged out of a corporate high-rise in handcuffs, her survival instincts kicked in. She immediately realized the luxury life Logan had promised her was a complete fabrication built on stolen money and massive syndicate debt. She did not shed a single tear for him. She packed her bags, completely drained the small joint checking account Logan had set up for her, permanently blocked his phone number and vanished from the city without a trace. Logan dropped the prison phone, realizing he was entirely abandoned. No money, no family, no mistress, and absolutely no future. The heavy rainstorm continued to relentlessly hammer the city over the next 2 days. I spent that time quietly restoring my home, replacing the broken dining chair, and placing Corinne's silver-framed photograph safely back on the mantel where it belonged. The house finally felt clean again, entirely purged of the toxic invaders who had tried to steal it. On the third evening, the loud, rhythmic drumming of the rain was interrupted by a soft, hesitant knock at my front door. I set down my book, walked across the hardwood floor, and pulled the door open. My daughter Jasmine was standing alone on the wooden porch. She had no umbrella and no coat. She was soaked to the absolute bone, her wet hair plastered flat against her cheeks. She looked incredibly exhausted, her eyes hollow and completely drained of the bright, arrogant energy Logan had infected her with over the last 2 years. I stood in the doorway waiting for her to speak. I expected her to cry. I expected her to collapse into my arms, apologize profusely, and beg me to use my massive trust fund to pay off her mounting medical school debts or buy her a comfortable new apartment to help her start over. I had $18 million sitting in the bank. I could have easily erased every single one of her problems with a single phone call to Bradley. But Jasmine did not ask to come inside out of the freezing rain. She did not reach out to hug me or ask for a single dime. Instead, she unzipped the wet jacket she was wearing and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She held it out to me with a trembling, pale hand. I took the envelope and opened the flap. Inside was a stack of legal documents. They were formal marriage annulment papers, fully completed and already signed by Jasmine at the bottom in dark blue ink. She had officially initiated the legal process to completely erase Logan from her life. She looked up at me, the rain washing down her face, and spoke with a quiet, heartbreaking clarity. She told me she had spent the last 3 days replaying every single horrible thing she had allowed Logan to say and do to me. She looked me right in the eye and delivered a painful, absolute truth. She said, "I do not deserve your money, Dad, and I do not deserve to live in this house." Jasmine tightened her jaw, fighting back the tears that threatened to break her composure. She told me she had allowed a monster to completely disrespect the man who had sacrificed everything for her simply because she was too weak to stand up for herself. She took a slow step backward into the pouring rain. She told me she was moving into a tiny studio apartment near the hospital and taking on extra graveyard shifts to pay her own rent. She stated that she needed to figure out exactly who she was without my protection and without a manipulative man telling her what to think. She turned around and walked slowly down the porch stairs into the dark, rainy street. She was leaving my life entirely, choosing the brutal hardship of independence over the comfortable safety of my wealth. I stood on the wooden porch and watched my daughter's silhouette disappear into the heavy curtain of rain. A lesser man, a weaker father, would have run down those wooden steps, grabbed her by the arm, and dragged her back inside to the warmth of the house. I would have told her everything was going to be fine, that my secret millions could easily shield her from the brutal consequences of her choices. But I did not move. I let the cold wind wash over me, knowing that rescuing her now would be the absolute worst thing I could do for her soul. I called out to her just before she turned the corner to walk down the dark street. I told her she was completely right. I spoke loud enough to cut through the sound of the storm, making sure every single word landed with absolute clarity. I said, "You allowed a man to disrespect your father in your own home. You stood by in complete silence while he actively plotted to destroy my life and steal my sanctuary. You need to find out exactly who you are without my money cushioning your fall and without his toxic voice poisoning your mind." Jasmine stopped walking for a brief second, her head bowed in the pouring rain before she nodded slowly and disappeared entirely into the shadows of the city. I did not see or speak to Jasmine for the next 6 months, but I kept a very close, quiet eye on her through the private investigator I retained. She did exactly what she promised to do. She moved out of the luxurious fake high society condo Logan had rented and signed a lease on a tiny rundown studio apartment in one of the worst neighborhoods near the Metropolitan Hospital. She sold her expensive wedding ring, her designer clothes, and her luxury handbag to a local pawn shop just to afford her first month of rent and a cheap mattress to sleep on. Without the massive safety net of my secret trust fund or the $50,000 residency account she had foolishly drained for Logan, the harsh reality of her financial situation hit her like a speeding freight train. She picked up grueling graveyard shifts at the hospital, working 80 to 90 hours a week just to keep the lights on and buy cheap groceries. My investigator sent me weekly reports and photographs. I saw pictures of my beautiful daughter sleeping on public transit buses because she was too exhausted to drive safely. I saw her eating cold soup out of a plastic container in the hospital break room, her eyes shadowed with profound physical and mental exhaustion. It absolutely broke my heart to see my only child struggling so intensely. Every single fiber of my being wanted to drive down there, hand her Corinne's Black Centurion card, and bring her home to a comfortable life. But I forced myself to stay away. This was her true atonement. She was systematically stripping away the entitled, arrogant layers that Logan had carefully built around her over the last 2 years. She was learning the actual value of a hard-earned dollar and the heavy price of betrayal. She was slowly, painfully rebuilding her character from the ground up entirely on her own terms, proving she was truly her mother's daughter. While Jasmine was busy rebuilding her shattered life in the grueling medical wards of the hospital, Logan's life was being systematically dismantled inside a massive federal courthouse. 7 months after his dramatic arrest on the trading floor, the United States justice system finally brought him to trial. I put on my best tailored charcoal suit, drove downtown, and took a seat in the very back row of the public gallery. I wanted to look him right in the eye as his fraudulent empire officially crumbled into dust. The courtroom was packed with the angry, devastated victims of his corporate embezzlement scheme, but Logan looked absolutely pathetic. The arrogant, slick corporate broker who wore custom silk ties was entirely gone. He sat at the defense table wearing a loose, faded orange prison jumpsuit, his hair thinning rapidly and his face hollowed out by months of severe stress in a federal holding facility. He nervously bit his fingernails, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for anyone who might offer him a single shred of sympathy. He found absolutely none. The federal prosecutors did not even need to try very hard to secure a conviction. They had an absolute mountain of undeniable evidence, including the cloned hard drives, the financial transfer logs, and the audio recordings of his midnight confession in my home. But the final crushing blow to Logan's defense came from his own flesh and blood. To completely avoid being charged as criminal accomplices and serving federal prison time themselves, Logan's parents took the witness stand and testified directly against their own son. I sat in the gallery with my hands folded, resting quietly on my lap, watching his mother raise her right hand and swear on a Bible to tell the whole truth. The exact same woman who had demanded I be thrown into a dark basement now sat under the bright courtroom lights and completely destroyed her child. She wept loudly for the jury, portraying herself as a naive, innocent victim of his sociopathic manipulation. She testified under oath that Logan had explicitly bragged about forging my medical documents and paying off a corrupt psychiatrist to steal my property. His father took the stand next, confirming every single detail of the illegal syndicate loans and the fraudulent real estate fire sale. Logan stared at his parents from the defense table, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock and horror as they eagerly threw him under the bus to save their own miserable skins. They had taught him everything he knew about greed, arrogance, and betrayal, and now they were giving him a final brutal masterclass in self-preservation. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on all 42 federal charges. The judge, a stern, unforgiving man who had zero tolerance for white-collar criminals preying on the elderly, ordered Logan to stand for his sentencing. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. The judge delivered a blistering speech calling Logan a malignant predator who lacked any fundamental human morality. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down and officially sentenced Logan to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. 2 large federal marshals immediately grabbed Logan by the arms, the heavy steel chains around his waist clinking loudly against the wooden table, as they dragged him away from the defense table toward the holding cells. Logan twisted his head around, desperately searching the gallery one last time. His panicked, tear-filled eyes finally locked onto mine across the crowded room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I simply sat there, my posture perfect, my face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I watched the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swing shut, sealing him away from the rest of the world for the next decade and a half. Exactly 1 year has passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom swung shut on my former son-in-law. The changing of the seasons brought a deep, profound peace back to my property. I spent the spring and summer meticulously restoring the sections of my house that Logan and his parents had carelessly damaged during their brief, arrogant invasion. The hardwood floors were sanded and polished. The broken dining room chair was replaced by a custom piece I built with my own hands in the basement, and Corinne's silver-framed photograph sat perfectly centered on the living room mantel. I was sitting on my front porch in my old rocking chair, enjoying the crisp morning air and the absolute quiet of my neighborhood. The loud, aggressive roar of Logan's leased luxury SUV no longer haunted my driveway. Instead, the soft crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of a modest 5-year-old used sedan. The car was painted a dull gray, possessed a few minor scratches on the bumper, and was the most beautiful vehicle I had ever seen. Jasmine turned off the engine and stepped out into the morning sunlight. She was not wearing expensive designer clothes or carrying a luxury handbag purchased with stolen money. She wore a simple pair of dark blue medical scrubs and a faded canvas jacket. She carried 2 steaming paper cups of black coffee from a cheap local diner down the street. She walked up the wooden porch steps and handed me one of the cups without a word. She sat down on the wooden step near my rocking chair, blowing gently on her hot coffee. She looked tired, the dark circles under her eyes revealing the brutal reality of the 80-hour graveyard shifts she was pulling at the Metropolitan Hospital. But beneath the profound physical exhaustion, there was a completely new, undeniable strength radiating from her. The nervous, easily manipulated girl who had desperately sought validation from a sociopathic con artist was entirely gone. In her place sat a hardened, independent woman who was finally taking total accountability for her own life. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the morning traffic pass by at the end of the street. Jasmine took a sip of her coffee and told me she had finally paid off the last remaining balance on her personal credit cards. She proudly stated that she had managed to save enough money from her hospital salary to cover her tiny studio apartment rent for the next 6 months. She did not ask me for a single dime. She did not hint at needing financial help, nor did she act entitled to the $18 million trust fund she now knew existed. I looked down at my daughter and felt a genuine, overwhelming sense of pride that I had not felt in years. I told her that her mother would be incredibly proud of the woman she was becoming. Jasmine looked out at the street and softly admitted that the last year had been the hardest period of her entire life, but it was also the first time she actually respected herself. Our relationship was still fractured. The massive scars of her betrayal would take years to fully heal, and we both understood that the unconditional blind trust we once shared was permanently altered. But what we were building now was significantly better. We were building a relationship founded on actual mutual respect and absolute truth, rather than financial dependency and silent resentment. We drank our coffee on the wooden porch, 2 adults who had survived a massive storm and come out stronger on the other side. Later that same evening, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom and adjusted the black silk bow tie of my custom-tailored tuxedo. I walked out of my quiet house and stepped into the back of a private town car waiting in my driveway. The car drove me directly into the heart of the glittering financial district, pulling up to the grand entrance of a spectacular, highly exclusive ballroom. It was the exact type of lavish venue Logan and his parents had constantly, desperately pretended to belong to. But tonight the room was filled with actual power, genuine respect, and absolute integrity. I walked through the double doors and was immediately greeted by Bradley, who was wearing an immaculate suit and holding 2 glasses of expensive champagne. We were not there to celebrate a corporate hostile takeover. We were hosting the inaugural charity gala for the newly established Corinne Financial Literacy and Legal Defense Fund for Seniors. I had authorized Bradley to allocate a massive portion of the trust fund to create a powerful, aggressive legal foundation specifically designed to protect elderly citizens from the exact type of financial predators and abusive guardianships that had almost destroyed my life. The grand ballroom was packed with respected city judges, senior hospital administrators, relentless civil rights attorneys, and dozens of people our foundation had already successfully rescued from abusive family members. When the dinner service concluded, the room fell entirely silent as the master of ceremonies called my name. I walked up to the brightly lit podium, the heavy crystal microphone resting in front of me. I looked out over the massive crowd of respected peers. I thought about Logan rotting away in his maximum security federal prison cell. I thought about his arrogant parents living in a miserable, cramped apartment their retirement funds completely seized. I thought about the profound peace I had finally reclaimed. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium, leaned into the microphone, and delivered my final message to the world. I told the crowd that society constantly expects older people to simply fade away into the background. They expect us to be quiet, to be compliant, and to hand over the fruits of our lifelong labor to the next generation without a single complaint. But I learned that sometimes the absolute most dangerous thing you can do to a greedy predator is to let them believe you are weak. I looked across the room and stated firmly that silence is not surrender. It is the time a man takes to sharpen the blade of truth. When my own family tried to throw me out onto the street and lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my life savings, I did not scream, I did not cry. I simply built a fortress of absolute, undeniable facts. People often ask me if I feel any guilt about completely destroying the lives of my son-in-law and his parents. I tell them I did not destroy them. I simply handed them the bill for their own arrogance. I stepped back from the podium as the entire ballroom erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. I had protected my wife's brilliant legacy, I had saved my daughter from a monster, and I had defended my own absolute dignity. I am Hollis, and I proved that a quiet man is always the most dangerous person in the room. Thank you for listening to my story. Let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you found my journey inspiring, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of ultimate calculated justice. Remember to always protect your peace guard, your hard-earned assets, and never let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness. See you in the next life story. I also learned that true protection sometimes requires stepping back. For decades, I shielded Jasmine from every hardship, mistakenly believing that providing absolute comfort was the highest form of love. But true love is not building a cage of comfort. It is giving them the strength to survive the storm alone. Seeing her walk away in the rain to build her own authentic life was the hardest yet proudest moment of my existence. We must let our children fall so they can learn how to rise properly. Share this video with a parent who needs to hear this truth today.